Hello there, I'm Colin Wright, and today I'd like to talk to you about Luddites. The early 19th century, especially in Europe and then eventually throughout the rest of the world as well, later in the century, but initially in Europe and particularly in Britain, it was a pretty crazy time for people living during that period in that area. They had these massive trade fleets. It made them incredibly wealthy. That's part of what allowed them to sustain their incredibly powerful military. But part of this was predicated on their textile industry, which at the time was a cottage industry, which literally meant people had little mechanisms for doing manual textile weaving and refining all the raw materials that they needed to produce said textiles in their cottages. They had this in their home. So families would make X number of textiles each week because they had these raw materials that they would then take and refine it into the threads that they needed, and then they'd take those threads and refine them into textiles. And then all of the textiles aggregated by these towns, full of these cottages, full of these hand-worked mechanisms, they would take all of that and trade it overseas for huge profits. They were starting to see competition from other places, though. Places like India in particular were able to do textiles faster and cheaper because they had these larger populations and they were able to pay people less in order to do it. So it was fortunate, for the British at least, that a confluence of new mechanisms arrived around the same time, all of them predicated on the idea of harnessing steam to produce the power necessary to move these mechanisms rather than relying on human labor. We're talking about the Industrial Revolution here, and this Industrial Revolution arrived first in Britain within their textile industry. It was hitting a bunch of other industries near simultaneously, but this was the big money industry, and consequently, it's where a lot of the investment was. And so a collection of snazzy, whiz-bang, fancy new technologies like spinning jennies, water frames, self-acting mules, and other elaborately named mechanisms were cobbled together into these semi-automated manufactories, so that all of those cottage industries, the people working from home on these little hand-operated gadgets, had to go into these giant factory settings where these giant auto looms and such were working, and all of these things were powered by steam. And this was really cool in a lot of ways. It allowed them to churn out orders of magnitude more textiles than they could when they were working from their cottages on these simpler human-powered machines. And that meant a lot more profits for the people who ran the textile industries. It meant cheaper products for the people on the other side buying them. And by some metrics at least, it meant higher quality textiles as well. Unfortunately, it also meant that the people running these companies, because they had all these cool new gadgets, they did not need all that muscle strength to operate the machines because, hey, we got steam. We've got so much coal to power this steam. We're good. We would prefer just to continue to invest in these machines that can output way more textiles than any human being, rather than investing in the humans. And so a lot of the skilled laborers who were paid accordingly because they had those skills that they'd built up over decades, they were kicked to the curb. And they didn't have a lot that they could do because they'd spent their lives developing these skill sets that they then passed on to their kids. And the owners of the textile mills, they would mostly hire people who had no skills, and in a lot of cases, little kids whose tiny little hands could fit inside the mechanisms when they needed to unstick something that was causing one of the machines to break down. This led to a period from 1811 to 1816, during which a group called the Luddites, who, by the way, took their name from a dude named Ned Ludd, who was probably fake, but he was one of those legendary folk hero sorts of characters like John Henry in the United States. He was the mythical manifestation of the idea that humans could outperform machines. He was that guy. He was John Henry, but British and for textiles. And so the Luddites took their name from Ned Ludd, this probably fake person, and they started destroying these machines that were putting them out of work. They were not the first group to do this. Many other groups in other industries and within the textile industry had been going around destroying these cool Industrial Revolution era gadgets that their employers were trying to bring in to put them out of work. But the Luddites were big because this industry was big, and it got so bad that Luddites were beginning to be shot on sight by anybody who saw them approaching one of these manufactories, whether or not they were intending to destroy anything on that particular day. They were that successful, if you choose to look at it that way. Now, this has continued to be interesting and relevant in part because we go through something of the same cycle every time some sort of transformative new technology or energy source for technologies comes along, something that then feeds the emergence of a slew of new technologies as opposed to a single new technology like a smartwatch. I'm talking things like electrification. I'm talking about things like computer code and the personal computer and smartphones to a certain degree. Those things are transformative and change a slew of industries simultaneously, whereas an individual technology, not so much. So those grand scale transformative technologies tend to change a whole lot within a lot of disconnected industries, and that tends to leave people kicked to the curb when their efforts are replaced. Kenya is the third biggest tea exporter on the planet. And they recently had a Luddite-like movement, and still are today, as of the day I'm recording this, because tea producers there have started bringing in automated machines that do the same labor, essentially, that tea pickers do, but they do it much faster. Again, orders of magnitude faster. It's thought that each one of these tea picker machines can do the work of 100 human tea pickers. And that's a problem for everybody who is not the owner of a tea-picking company and a bunch of tea-picking machines. Because in Kenya, most of the tea pickers are young women who don't have a lot of other job prospects, and they don't have a lot of transferable skills as a consequence. And they are thus, when put out of work, when no longer able to pick tea, not able to just jump over to another job. It's not like they can just put in a resume somewhere and be accepted. This is what they do, and this is all they have done. And that is the nature of the economy there right now. So there have been protests in the towns that are heavily reliant upon tea picking, and workers have been going through and setting fire to these machines. And so far, at least, about 10 of them have been lost at an estimated cost of somewhere around $1.2 million. Again, so far, these protests are ongoing. Now, this is relevant to people beyond textile workers and tea pickers in Kenya, because we've seen what could be the development of a transformative technology, an approach to using what are called large language models to create fairly sophisticated pieces of software that can do a whole lot of the things that so-called knowledge workers do today. A recent McKinsey report, that's a think tank who does all sorts of research on this sort of thing, they found that somewhere between 60 to 70% of the work done by knowledge workers, and that means workers who work at computers all day basically, 60 to 70% of the work people who work at computers do today could be replaced by AI, and at an equal or better level of quality than the humans working at those computers. Now, this is unlikely to be a 100% thing. It's unlikely that this type of software, even very high-end versions of it, will be able to do all the things that humans do all day, every day. But since so much of the work that we do already has been turned into isolated tasks, separate from the grand intention of that collection of tasks, that means we could see the diminishment of these positions so that people lose their paycheck positions and are taken on as more like Fiverr freelancers for independent chunks of those jobs that the AI can't handle for essentially free. Or it will mean the companies will need far fewer people, basically just AI managers, to make sure that they don't get stuck somewhere. The equivalent of hiring unskilled labor or children to come in and put their hands inside the machines to pull out whatever is obstructing the work the machine is trying to do back in the 19th century. So we're looking down the barrel of a period of potential large-scale unemployment for a huge collection of professions. And that's professions that can be automated in the real world, robots that are powered by sophisticated software that can build cars and sort boxes meant to be delivered by Amazon and that can pick tea leaves. But also software that can step in and write convincing marketing copy, do convincing design work, edit videos, work customer service. These are things that we're already seeing embryonic versions of today. And in 5 years, it's likely the versions that we're seeing today will seem just laughably out of date and unsophisticated. So while this is not a definitive thing, it is a potential point of concern for many of us. Even if you feel absolutely certain there's no way this type of software or something powered by it can come in and do your job, that sort of certainty is a lot softer and blurrier today than it would have been even 5 years ago, when relatively simplistic versions of what we have today were still being built. Now, the takeaway here is that we are probably entering a period of grand usurpation where a lot of us will be losing our jobs, and this will be happening at a scale that impacts entire industries and even economies. That means that hopefully we will see some sort of system, some sort of safety net potentially put into place to help the folks who are losing their jobs move on to something else, to acquire new education, new know-how, something that will allow them to continue to add value to society and to earn compensation on that value that they're adding, but in a way that doesn't punish them for happening to be unlucky enough to be in an industry that seemed secure and to have done work that added value to society for a long time, only to have the misfortune of being in a space where cost cutting was possible because of these new technologies. Now, on that same note, it's possible that some kind of guaranteed basic income will be necessary as well, because it's not as easy as being fired, deciding to get a new job, and then suddenly having all the skills and knowledge required to do that new job. Especially for the jobs necessary in the future, there's a very good chance we're going to need a decent period of education. That might mean years of education before you can move on to that new career path after a lifetime of having worked and done something else entirely. That means we will need support systems that will not just allow, but incentivize people to continue moving forward in this way. And that will almost certainly necessitate a collection of basic services and a way to continue to put a roof over one's head, to continue to feed one's family, and to be able to enjoy some modicum of leisure in between as well. And the only thing that I know about, at least, that works in that way, that still allows us to continue using the existing systems that we have, is making sure that there are social services available so that folks have a support system in between where they are now and where we want them and where they want to end up. Now, who's to say whether any of that will happen? Who's to say whether it will happen on time? It's very likely we'll start to see more spiky bits of this transition before we see any kind of amelioration efforts, at least on the scale necessary, from the folks in charge, and to have the capability to put those sorts of safety nets, those sorts of transitionary programs into place. But if we're going to benefit civilizationally, societally, from these types of transitional, evolutionary technological shifts, if that is indeed what this is, and it might not be. But if that does turn out to be what these fancy new AI technologies are, if we are going to benefit from that as a civilization, rather than just having a bare few people benefiting from it and everybody else suffering, and then maybe as a consequence developing fancy new guillotine technologies out of necessity, we are probably going to need some innovative new support systems as well. Now, the specifics of those support systems, I don't know. When they will arrive, I don't know. But if we want to avoid a situation in which it makes perfect sense for people to destroy as many of these new technologies as possible, that seems to be the only way to make this sort of transition survivable enough and equitable enough to make it worth everyone's while to play ball with where things seem to be going, rather than looking for an entirely new game to play.